My name is Ethan Mercer, and the day I came home from the VA clinic with a steel brace wrapped around my left knee, I found an $8,500 fine stuck to my windshield because, according to my homeowners association, I had parked too close to my own front door. At first I laughed because I honestly thought somebody was pulling a joke that had gone way too far, but by the time the sun went down, that little orange notice had become the beginning of the most expensive mistake my HOA board would ever make. Looking back now, people always ask me if I planned everything that happened afterward, if I was waiting for a chance to teach them a lesson, and the truth is almost disappointing because I wasn't looking for a fight. I was just trying to make it from my front door to my truck without feeling like someone was driving a railroad spike through my leg every time I took another step. I live outside Colorado Springs in a neighborhood called Aspen Ridge, one of those places where every mailbox matches. Every lawn gets measured like it's competing in a golf tournament. And somebody always seems to know when your trash can stayed out 12 minutes longer than the rules allow. I bought my house almost 7 years earlier after finishing my time in the Army. 8 years that left me with more memories than I wanted, and a body that worked just well enough to convince strangers nothing was wrong until they watched me walk. After leaving the military, I spent over a decade working as a legal assistant for a small law firm that handled disability claims, housing disputes, and the kind of civil cases most people never think about until life drops one in their lap. That job taught me something simple. People love talking about rules until someone shows them the law. 3 months before everything exploded, an SUV ran a red light and clipped my truck hard enough to twist my knee into something my orthopedic surgeon politely described as complicated. Surgery helped, but recovery was slow, and my doctor kept repeating the same instructions every appointment. Avoid unnecessary walking. Keep weight off the joint. Use the brace. Use the crutches. Don't be stubborn. Anyone who has ever served in the military knows telling a veteran not to be stubborn is like telling rain not to fall. But I listened because the pain made sure I remembered every word. My driveway sat only a few feet from my front porch. Yet because of the angle and the swelling in my knee, getting in and out there had become difficult. So for years, I'd parked directly along the curb in front of my own house, exactly where dozens of neighbors parked every single day. Nobody had complained. Nobody had written a warning. Even the garbage trucks squeezed through without a problem. Then one Tuesday afternoon, I came home from physical therapy, balanced on my crutches, and there it was. A bright orange violation notice plastered across my windshield like someone wanted the whole neighborhood to admire it. Unauthorized parking, fire lane obstruction, immediate assessment, $18,500. I actually looked up and down the street expecting hidden cameras because the curb wasn't painted red. There wasn't a fire hydrant anywhere nearby, and there wasn't a single sign saying I couldn't park there. I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures from every angle. Years in legal work had trained me to document first and ask questions later. My next call went straight to the HOA office where the board president, Linda Crawford, answered with the kind of cheerful customer service voice people use when they're already planning to ruin your afternoon. I explained who I was, told her I'd just returned from the VA clinic, reminded her I'd lived there for years without any parking issues, and asked if there had been some kind of mistake. There was a pause long enough to make me think she was checking records, but instead she calmly said, "Mr. Mercer, residents recovering from injuries are expected to use the visitor parking lot if they need special accommodations." I almost laughed again until I remembered she was serious. "The visitor lot is almost 400 feet uphill," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm on crutches," she answered without missing a beat. "Then perhaps you should leave earlier when you need to go somewhere." That sentence landed harder than the fine itself. I took a slow breath and explained that I wasn't asking for special treatment, only temporary common sense while my knee healed. She finally agreed to schedule me for the next HOA board meeting 2 weeks later, saying the board would review my request then. 2 weeks. It felt like forever when every trip from my truck to my front door left sweat running down my back from pain alone. Every morning I wondered whether another ticket would be waiting. Every evening I reminded myself not everyone on the board could possibly think like Linda Crawford. Surely somebody would look at my medical paperwork, my VA disability documentation, my doctor's restrictions, and realize this entire situation had gotten ridiculous. I still believed the meeting would solve everything because I hadn't yet figured out the one thing that would change my life forever. Linda Crawford wasn't trying to enforce a parking rule. She was trying to prove that nobody in the neighborhood was allowed to challenge her authority. And unfortunately for her, she had just picked the worst possible person to make that point to. The board meeting finally arrived, and I remember thinking the hardest part of my day would be making it from the handicap space outside the clubhouse to the conference room without my knee locking up halfway there. I was wrong. The hardest part was sitting through 11 minutes that completely changed the way I looked at people who hide behind titles and bylaws. The room itself looked exactly how you'd imagine an HOA boardroom. Framed community awards on the walls. Coffee that smelled like it had been sitting there since sunrise. Stacks of binders nobody actually read. And 5 people who somehow managed to look inconvenienced by my existence before I even sat down. Linda Crawford occupied the chair at the center of the table like she was presiding over a courtroom instead of a volunteer neighborhood committee. To her right sat the treasurer, Martin Ellis, a retired accountant who never looked up from his calculator. And beside him was Susan Palmer, who nodded at everything Linda said before Linda even finished saying it. Across from them sat 2 other board members whose names I barely remembered because they hardly spoke the entire evening. I laid my folder on the table, thick with medical records, VA paperwork, photographs of the curb, measurements, and a letter from my orthopedic surgeon explaining why limiting my walking distance was medically necessary. Before I could even open it, Linda smiled politely and said, "Mr. Mercer, we appreciate your service, but community rules apply equally to everyone." That sentence sounded reasonable until you realized it completely ignored why I was sitting there in the first place. I slid the doctor's letter toward her. She never touched it. Instead, she folded her hands together and asked whether I had considered parking in the visitor lot until my recovery was complete. "It's 400 feet uphill," I replied. "I've measured it. My surgeon specifically instructed me to minimize unnecessary walking." Martin finally looked up long enough to say, "Lots of residents walk farther than that every day." I couldn't help smiling a little. Most of them aren't recovering from reconstructive knee surgery. Susan sighed dramatically and said, "If we make an exception for you, everyone will want one." That was the moment I realized nobody intended to discuss my situation honestly. They had already decided the answer before I walked through the door. I spent another 5 minutes explaining that I wasn't asking for a permanent reserved space. I wasn't demanding special privileges. I simply wanted temporary permission to continue parking where I'd legally parked for years while my knee healed. I even offered to provide updated medical reports every month if they wanted proof of my recovery. Linda glanced at the clock, shuffled a few papers she clearly hadn't read, then announced that the board had voted unanimously to deny my request. The original assessment would remain. Beginning the following morning, additional penalties of $250 per day would be added until the violation was corrected. For a second, the room became strangely quiet, almost peaceful, because my brain refused to process what she'd just said. $8,500 had somehow become the opening bid. Then Linda leaned forward across the table, lowered her voice just enough that everyone had to listen carefully, and delivered the sentence I can still hear as clearly today as I did that night. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "if walking 400 feet is too difficult for you, maybe this community isn't the right place to live." Nobody laughed. Nobody objected. Nobody looked embarrassed. They simply sat there pretending those words were perfectly acceptable. I gathered my papers 1 page at a time, thanked them for their time, stood carefully on my crutches, and walked out without another word. I could feel Linda watching me all the way to the door, probably convinced she'd won. The truth was she had just handed me the one thing I needed more than any witness or photograph. She had given me intent. On the drive home, I didn't feel angry as much as disappointed. During my years working at the law firm, I'd met landlords who genuinely tried to help disabled tenants, employers who bent over backward to accommodate injured workers, even businesses that spent thousands of dollars making entrances accessible because they understood dignity mattered. What I just experienced wasn't ignorance. It was arrogance. There is a difference, and the law treats them differently too. I got home a little after 9. Made myself a sandwich I never finished, brewed a pot of coffee, and walked into the spare bedroom that doubled as my office. In the back of an old filing cabinet sat several binders from my legal assistant days. I hadn't opened them in years, but muscle memory is a funny thing. Within minutes, I had case law spread across my desk, federal regulations open on my laptop, and a legal pad filling with notes. I wasn't practicing law. I wasn't pretending to be an attorney, but I knew exactly how to organize facts, preserve evidence, and recognize when someone's conduct crossed the line from unfair into illegal. Around midnight, I called my former supervisor, Rebecca Lawson. She answered on the 3rd ring, sounding half asleep. "Ethan," she mumbled, Please tell me somebody isn't in jail. I laughed for the first time all day. Not yet. 20 minutes later, I'd explained everything. There was silence before she finally said, "Did they actually deny a reasonable accommodation after you provided medical documentation?" "Yes." "Did anyone say anything inappropriate?" I repeated Linda's exact words. Rebecca let out a slow whistle. "Well, she shouldn't have said that." The next morning, she invited me to stop by the office. I wasn't looking for free representation, and she knew that. What I wanted was another set of experienced eyes to make sure I wasn't letting emotion cloud my judgment. We spent almost 3 hours reviewing every document I'd collected. Rebecca never exaggerated, never promised an easy victory. But at one point, she leaned back in her chair and said something I'll never forget. "Ethan, if everything you've shown me is accurate, this isn't really about parking anymore." She was right. Parking had become the symptom. The real issue was discrimination. We organized everything chronologically. Photos of the curb showing no fire lane markings. 6 years of neighborhood photographs showing my vehicle parked in the same location without incident. Medical restrictions from my orthopedic surgeon. VA disability documentation. HOA emails. Meeting notices. The denial letter. My handwritten notes from the hearing, recorded less than 10 minutes after leaving the room while every conversation remained fresh in my memory. Rebecca suggested I add one more thing. "Write down exactly how this has affected your daily life," she said. "Judges understand statutes. People understand stories." That advice stayed with me. By sunset, I had drafted a formal demand package unlike anything my HOA had probably ever received. It wasn't threatening. It wasn't emotional. It simply outlined the facts, identified the relevant housing protections, explained why denying a reasonable accommodation could expose the association to significant liability, and offered them one final opportunity to resolve the matter voluntarily before outside agencies became involved. I mailed copies to the board, their management company, and their insurance carrier. Then I filed complaints with the appropriate state and federal housing authorities, attaching every piece of supporting evidence I'd spent 2 exhausting days organizing. Once everything was submitted, there was nothing left to do except wait. 48 hours later, my phone rang while I was icing my knee. The caller identified himself as a housing compliance mediator assigned to review my complaint. He asked several questions, confirmed he had received my documentation, and then quietly said, "Mr. Mercer, your paperwork is exceptionally thorough." I smiled despite myself. 12 years pushing legal files across desks had finally paid off. 2 days after that, another call came, this time from someone inside the HOA management company. Their tone had changed completely. They wanted additional information. They wanted clarification. They wanted copies of medical records they'd ignored the first time, somewhere behind closed doors. People who had laughed off my request were suddenly reading laws instead of bylaws. And for the first time since that orange sticker appeared on my windshield, I realized something important. Linda Crawford still believed she was fighting over a parking space. She hadn't yet figured out she was defending a decision that could cost her entire board far more than $8,500. And the longer they refused to admit their mistake, the more expensive that lesson was becoming. The next 6 weeks felt strangely quiet, almost too quiet. The kind of silence that usually means something big is happening behind doors you can't see. I kept going to physical therapy, kept parking where I'd always parked, and kept documenting every new notice they slipped under my windshield. Because once the complaints had been filed, I knew this wasn't about arguing with Linda Crawford anymore. It was about letting the process run its course. Around day 40, the management company requested mediation. But by then, the conversation had completely changed. Nobody wanted to discuss parking distances anymore. They wanted to know when I first requested an accommodation, whether I had medical documentation, whether the board had reviewed it, whether anyone remembered exactly what had been said during that 11-minute hearing. Funny how confidence disappears once lawyers start asking specific questions instead of neighbors asking polite ones. A week later, I sat in a conference room across from Linda for the first time since the board meeting. She looked different. The sharp confidence she'd worn like expensive jewelry had been replaced with sleepless eyes and a stack of folders covered in sticky notes. Their attorney did almost all the talking. He acknowledged there had been communication failures, suggested misunderstandings had occurred, and asked whether I would consider resolving the matter privately. I listened without interrupting until he finished. Then I slid one sheet of paper across the table. It contained only 3 items. Withdraw every assessment. Approve a permanent accessible parking accommodation in writing. compensate me for the financial losses, legal expenses, and damages created by the board's actions. Linda stared at the page before finally speaking. You're asking for $73,000 over a parking space? I looked her in the eye and answered as calmly as I had the day she fined me. No, I'm asking for $73,000 because your board chose discrimination after being given every opportunity to choose common sense. Nobody said another word for several seconds. The mediator eventually broke to silence, reminding everyone that prolonged litigation would almost certainly cost substantially more than settlement if the evidence supported my claims. 3 days later, my phone rang. The HOA had accepted every material term. They would eliminate every fine, pay the full settlement, reimburse documented expenses, install permanent 8A-compliant curb markings in front of my home, recognize the space as my approved accessible parking location for the next 5 years, and conduct mandatory fair housing training for every future board member. Before signing, I made one unusual request. I asked that Linda personally read each provision of the agreement aloud during the final meeting. She looked irritated, then embarrassed, but her attorney quietly advised her to do exactly that. So she did, one paragraph after another, her voice growing softer every time she reached another sentence, acknowledging what the board should have done from the beginning. When she finished reading the final page, she closed the folder and looked down at the table. I remembered exactly what she'd told me weeks earlier, and I couldn't resist asking one question. Linda, when this started, you said maybe I shouldn't live here if I couldn't walk 400 feet. After everything that's happened, who do you think forgot what being a good neighbor actually means? She never answered. She simply stood up and walked out of the room. The following morning, the community received an email announcing the resignation of Linda Crawford and every remaining board member. Within another week, contractors arrived outside my house, painted the curb blue, installed official accessible parking signs, and removed every violation notice from my property records. The funny part is that my knee eventually healed well enough that I probably could have walked from the visitor lot again. But by then, that parking space had become something much bigger than convenience. Every time I pull into it now, I don't see blue paint or a metal sign. I see proof that rules should never matter more than people. And that authority without compassion usually destroys itself eventually. I still live in the same house. I still wave to my neighbors. Most of them stop to chat now instead of rushing inside because they watched the entire situation unfold and realize how easily any one of them could have been next. People sometimes tell me I should have just paid the fine and moved on because life is too short for legal battles. Maybe they're right, but if nobody ever stands up when power is abused, then people like Linda never learn where the limits actually are. So now, I'd like to hear from you. Was I justified in taking the fight all the way after the board ignored every reasonable request? Or should I have let it go for the sake of peace? If you were sitting in that meeting, whose side would you have been on? Share your thoughts in the comments because I read every one of them. And if this story reminded you that knowing your rights can change everything, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next story.